So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming this afternoon for this talk, the day after President's Day. And a talk from one of our distinguished professors to help us celebrate the opening of an exhibition on the American presidency, which takes us from George to George and beyond. So I hope you'll enjoy the exhibit and have a patriotic cake pop afterwards. But for now, we're going to learn a little bit about the American presidency and how it has evolved. Most recently, with our current president, how the position, how our understanding of what it means to be the President of the United States may be shifting, changing, evolving, with our own dear professor, Thomas Schwartz from the History Department. He's the best person on campus to give this lecture because he is what we call a presidential historian, which always sounds so dignified to me, like you should go around in special white airplanes. So he's a presidential historian and a scholar of great note who has written on Lyndon Baines Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Henry Kissinger. He knows a lot about a lot of presidents and the role of the presidency in American history and what it has meant for our country and for the world. He's, as I said, a very distinguished scholar. He has won the Harry S. Truman Book Award. He's been a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. I could go on and on, but this is a very learned, thoughtful, and I think will be a very scintillating speaker for us today on the state of the American presidency. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me back there? Okay. Okay. I want to thank Valerie, the library's director, for this invitation to speak today. She used the right method to lure me into it by mentioning that her friend, Tom Knock, from Southern Methodist University, suggested me. Tom Knock is an outstanding historian who has written an excellent study of Woodrow Wilson, and the first part of a biography of a man whose campaign I worked on 45 years ago, George McGovern. It was hard to say no to such a request. I suppose I was asked as well because I am what is called a presidential historian. I should add that within the academy, this is not particularly a term of respect. Presidential historians are seen as superficial popularizers who show up on television documentaries or for commentary after various events. But some of this is also academic jealousy. Some presidential historians, like Michael Beschloss, David McCullough, or our own John Meacham, also write books that actually sell and the public wants to read, and that irritates academics as well. So I decided for once not to bring along slides or internet links for this talk. Ever since my then 10-year-old daughter Helene back in the early 2000s taught me how to use PowerPoint, I think I've been inclined to rely on it too heavily when I speak, and since most of my topics are relatively recent history, I've been able to get away with it. But I decided this time I would keep my lecture a little shorter and avoid the usual props. This also means that I avoid the usual technical stuff that goes wrong. You've heard of wardrobe malfunctions. I have all sorts of technical malfunctions whenever I try to do sort of more complicated stuff, so I'm kind of pleased to be back in the old-fashioned route of just giving a lecture. Let me start off by saying that I found this a difficult talk to compose. I decided early on that I didn't want to do another anti-Trump tirade. I had done that enough during the year and a half or so before the November 2016 election, to the point of becoming very boring to my 3 daughters and probably fairly tiresome to my students. I even got to travel as part of the alumni Vanderbilt travel classroom experience, supported by my friend Donna Johnson, to present a talk about TV ads and the election in historical perspective, but which was another thinly veiled anti-Trump tirade. The result of all of this is that on November 9th, 2016, I found myself rather humbled by the election results, revealing how much I had let my own ideological bias blind me from taking a more clear-sighted approach to what was actually happening politically in the country. I realized I was in good company here with about 90% of other academics and historians, but that didn't make me feel any better. I have made a concerted effort to understand better the Trump phenomenon. But in the same way that I dislike the Trump campaign's use of the slogan "America First" with its connection to the anti-Semitic isolationist movement of the 1930s, I also found myself reluctant to join the resistance, a term which somehow tries to compare our ugly and messy politics to the life and death struggle of people in Nazi-occupied Europe. And despite my commitment to First Amendment and free speech, I actually think all World War II and Nazi analogies should be banned from political discourse. As someone who cares about politics and policy, it has been a difficult transition to the era of Donald Trump. Last March, I got an email from a very dear and longtime European academic friend of mine, who's known me for more than 30 years, who said he felt sorry for me. Quote, "because especially since I know your will to loyalty, which you normally try to display when it comes to your president," unquote. His note struck me, but I realized he was right. When I interacted with my friends and colleagues from other countries, I frequently found myself defending the American president and his policies, even when I might not have done so at home. To some extent, I operated on the famous principle once enunciated by Michigan Senator Arthur Vanderbilt as the Cold War was beginning to take shape that, quote, "politics stops at the water's edge," unquote. That said, I knew that our 45th president would be a difficult president to defend, and that I would find myself in an uncomfortable position with my European colleagues if I tried to put up a defense. This past weekend's tweet storm, and particularly the president's suggestion that the FBI might have prevented the Florida school shooting if it had not been so focused on Russia's role in the campaign, reminded me again of how difficult it is to offer much defense for this president. So as I was thinking of finding inspiration for this talk, I thought I would take a look at the actual artifacts in the library's exhibit on the presidency. Teresa Gray was kind enough to give me a nice early discussion of these, and I encourage all of you to look at them. I found myself drawn to three sets in particular. The first is a set of ship's papers, dated 1796 and signed by then President George Washington. Produced in three languages, French, English, and Dutch, these papers were designed to be shown as proof of the nationality of the American ship, and more importantly, its neutrality in the conflicts which were sweeping Europe in the wake of the French Revolution. I teach about this subject, telling students how difficult the first years of the American Republic were, as it was torn by differences between the two developing political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, and how those differences were amplified and intensified by different reactions to the French Revolution. This was another time of great political polarization in America, and President Washington himself, aided by his immigrant and now Broadway famous advisor, Alexander Hamilton, composed a farewell address that would encourage Americans to keep out of the political affairs of Europe. Washington's great fear was that America's political divisions would be exploited by foreign powers for their own purposes, to weaken and undermine American democracy, a fear which seems increasingly prophetic in today's internet-connected world. This would be American policy for about 150 years, until the Cold War and the Soviet threat to Europe called forth the creation of NATO and America's first modern entangling alliance. Now, very close by these ship papers, in another part of the exhibit, is the second item I would draw your attention to. It's an autographed picture of Woodrow Wilson in Paris at the negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson is pictured with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the French leader Georges Clemenceau, and the Italian Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. In the picture, Wilson is the most striking figure of the Big Four, reflective, I think, of his importance in the peacemaking process. I was taken with the contrast between these two exhibits. One reflecting a moment in America's early years where the president recognized the nation was very weak and tried to keep it from being buffeted by the storms of international conflict. The second, only 123 years later, where the president had pronounced his 14 points, recognizing that the United States was now a dominant international power, redrawing the map of Europe, and putting forth his own, what we now call Wilsonian vision of a new international order, one which would be based on self-determination and the equality of nations within a League of Nations. That contrast in relative power between these two moments also, of course, contributed to the significance of the presidency for most Americans, and culminated in many respects during the Cold War, where an American president was often referred to as the most powerful man in the world, and particularly because he controlled nuclear weapons and had his finger on the button which could trigger nuclear war. We've unfortunately been reminded of that quite recently when the president chose to compare the size of nuclear arsenals with his North Korean counterpart. Needless to say, that was a strange thing to say about something which could be so potentially destructive. But it brings me to the third collection of memorabilia in the display, those connected to President John F. Kennedy's visit to Vanderbilt on Saturday, May 18, 1963, now almost 55 years ago. On display over here are the program of the visit, a photo of the plaque at the stadium where Kennedy spoke, seating tickets from the event, a Vanderbilt Gazette story signed by President Kennedy, with a White House letter from his very loyal secretary with the ironic last name of Lincoln, authenticating Kennedy's signature. It is quite a collection, capturing Vanderbilt's pride in hosting a Kennedy visit, but also the very special place John Kennedy retains in American memory. What's not there, interestingly enough, is Kennedy's speech. And the exhibit provoked my curiosity. What did President Kennedy say when he came to Vanderbilt? Kennedy's speech here took place a month before three of his most important and most memorable speeches he would give in the White House. The first, which came on June 11, 1963, would finally embrace the civil rights movement and struggle. Kennedy would call it a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The second, a speech given at American University around the same time, called for a new relationship with the Soviet Union, a hope for peace, with the memorable and poignant words, quote, "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." That speech would help bring about the first post-1945 treaty with the Soviet Union banning the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. The third speech, given later in the same month, was given before an enormous crowd in the divided city of our World War II enemy, now turned ally, in which Kennedy would proclaim that he took pride in the words, "Ich bin ein Berliner." The Vanderbilt speech is not of that caliber. In fact, one impression of it is that it is extraordinarily cautious on the issue of civil rights, making an oblique reference to the shocking images coming out of Birmingham, Alabama, namely the fire hoses and police dogs against young African-American children in the previous weeks, but simply stating, quote, "The nation, indeed the whole world, has watched recent events in the United States with alarm and dismay. No one can deny the complexity of the problems involved in assuring to all of our citizens their full rights as Americans, but no one can gainsay the fact that the determination to secure these rights is in the highest traditions of American freedom." Kennedy's caution on civil rights has been criticized and was criticized at the time, but the Vanderbilt speech does show he was moving toward a greater understanding, a growth in office that is one reason for the enduring affection many Americans have for him. His main point in the Vanderbilt speech was to encourage, as he put it, the educated citizen to serve the public, particularly encouraging students to consider things like the Peace Corps or some other forms of government service. Kennedy emphasized in his speech that he came to Vanderbilt to speak to the students, quote, "not of your rights as Americans, but of your responsibilities," unquote. It is very much in keeping with his famous "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country" inaugural address. The call to public service and responsibility is one we associate with Kennedy, and that encouraged the idealism and service of millions of young Americans during this era. Let me make a confession. I come from a Kennedy-supporting family and a Kennedy community. One of my earliest memories is being dragged as a 6-year-old to wait for the Kennedy campaign motorcade through my hometown of Rochester, New York in September of 1960. My mother later told me that when she saw him standing in the car, bathed by city streetlights, she thought he looked like a Greek god, an image that I imagine many Americans had of Kennedy. I also remember very distinctly my teachers at my Catholic school crying on November 22nd, 1963, after they heard the news of President Kennedy's death. I remember my parents putting a candle in the window that evening along with the rest of the houses in the neighborhood to signify this sense of loss. Perhaps because of my background, I am never surprised at polls that still show Kennedy to be the most popular of presidents since World War II. The University of Virginia, in fact, is out with a poll that says just that, with the result this week. So thinking about Kennedy and the image he projected was in my mind as I tried to think about the presidency and its place in American life and what the presidency of Donald Trump means for it. I found myself drawn to an older and now somewhat controversial concept, which is usually attributed to the American sociologist Robert Bellah, who about 50 years ago entitled an article, "Civil Religion in America." Bellah recognized that, quote, although matters of personal religious belief, worship, and association are considered to be strictly private affairs, there are at the same time certain common elements of religious orientation that the great majority of Americans share. Bellah believed, quote, that the public religious dimension was expressed in a set of beliefs, symbols, and rituals that he called America's civil religion. This article was written in 1966, and it's perhaps not surprising that Bellah saw such events as the inauguration of a president, and in this particular moment, Kennedy's inauguration, as an important ceremonial event in this religion. The fact that President Kennedy's first words in his inaugural address had this religious tone. Quote, we observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears nearly a century and 3/4 ago, prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. Kennedy went on to say in words that I think very much connect to this idea of civil religion, quote, the world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. I can't do full justice to Bellah's argument or those that challenge it in this talk. But needless to say, the presidency and the president plays a central role in America's civil religion. After all, I think the president can be seen providing moral leadership in this public faith, sometimes as a symbol, sometimes as a prophet. George Washington was seen as something akin to a Moses figure who led Americans out of bondage in the British Empire to freedom. Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War, that time of testing for the Union, brought with it the themes of death, sacrifice, and rebirth, captured in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address with its call for a new birth of freedom. Lincoln himself becomes a martyr to the cause, with his Christ-like image confirmed through his assassination on Good Friday. Other presidents have assumed various roles in America's civil religion. Franklin Roosevelt's leadership through the Great Depression and World War II elevated him to a position in the American pantheon as something of a second Lincoln, in saving not only the nation from the world saving not only the nation, but the world from the forces of evil in Nazi Germany and Japan. Dwight Eisenhower has sometimes been called the nation's pastor during the Cold War era of the 1950s. Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton had high moments in their presidency as comforter-in-chief after tragedies like the Challenger disaster or the Oklahoma City bombing. Even those who are strong critics of the concept of an American civil religion, such as Professor Frederick Geddix, acknowledged, for example, that the election of Barack Obama as the first African-American president confirmed for many Americans something very important about their nation, that, quote, "Here there are possibilities that exist in few other countries." It is in this role of the president within American history where it's hard to see how Donald Trump fits. Whether it comes from his abrasive personal characteristics, the demagogic and nationalist rhetoric, the constant bragging, the insulting language toward opponents and critics, the conspiratorial mindset, the incredible insecurity that manifests itself in the need for praise and affirmation from those around him, the crude language toward racial minorities, there is so much that's disagreeable and offensive and unpresidential about this norm-defying president that it's not easy to avoid despair or overreaction. I would argue that our uneasiness with Trump comes at least in part from this sense of what presidents should be within the American civil religion and what does constitute presidential behavior. Although other presidents have grown into this while in office, it seems very unlikely that Trump will ever play this role. Now, on the one hand, this could be a positive development. My colleague over in Benson Hall, in the English department, not history department though, Professor Dana Nelson, published a book about 10 years ago entitled "Bad for Democracy: How the Presidency Undermines the Power of the People," in which she argued against what she called presidentialism and made the case that Americans had placed too much of their faith and beliefs in the presidency, and this was damaging to democracy. Now, Nelson's book shows the clear influence of the Bush era, and it may be worth recalling how polarized feelings were toward George W. and his administration at that time. For many liberals, Barack Obama restored their faith in the institution of the presidency. But Nelson's warning remains. Presidents have become too powerful, and it would strengthen our democracy to restrict those powers and to focus less on the presidency as the center of American political life. Having acknowledged that, perhaps we have come to a time in American history where it is important to rein in the presidency, and we might also want to avoid the danger of over-romanticizing the 43 men before Trump who have served as presidents. Many of our presidents have been deeply flawed, and we need to be honest in understanding our past leaders. 12 American presidents were slaveholders, and 2 of the faces on Mount Rushmore, Washington and Jefferson, owned a significant number of human beings. Through the miracle of DNA technology, we know now that political pamphleter and journalist James Callender was right, and that Thomas Jefferson fathered 5 children with his slave mistress, Sally Hemings. Andrew Jackson, with whom Trump says he identifies, killed a man in a duel and enacted a brutal removal of Native American tribes from east of the Mississippi. Theodore Roosevelt, another figure on Mount Rushmore, believed in racial hierarchies and was crucial to encouraging American imperial rule in the Caribbean and the Philippines. And Woodrow Wilson, who spoke so eloquently about the self-determination of peoples, reintroduced the practice of segregation to Washington and espoused racist beliefs. In modern times, the secret White House tapes, used so abundantly by Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, reveals levels of vulgarity and racial remarks that might have made Trump blush. And what we have learned about John Kennedy's private behavior toward women demonstrates an extraordinary recklessness that, had he lived, would have severely tarnished his reputation in a way that Bill Clinton's now experiencing. Having said all this, though, let me return to John Kennedy, still the most popular president of the post-war era. Stephen King's novel, 11/22/63, posits the idea that Kennedy's assassination is prevented by a time traveler from the future, only to have his assumption that had Kennedy lived, he would not have escalated the war in Vietnam, end in an unmitigated disaster. But even if one doesn't follow King's plot, what we do know is that John Kennedy, flawed and reckless private life and all, is still responsible for the fact that millions of Americans are alive today who might not have been. His cool leadership and careful weighing of the alternatives during the Cuban Missile Crisis helped to prevent a nuclear war, which, while it might not have wiped out the entire planet, as many at the time believed, nevertheless did save millions of American and Russian lives. And even though I believe that the emotions connected with Kennedy's tragic death play an important role in how Americans feel about him, this salient fact that in a crucial moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis he acted with deliberation, care, and wisdom make it so that he deserves his recognition from history. We have perhaps invested too much power, both real and symbolic, in presidents, and there are ways in which the institutional pushback against the Trump presidency is a much-needed corrective. But perhaps we can also hope that President Trump, and maybe more importantly the people around him in his administration, with all the personal flaws and problems which are on display for all to see, somehow rise to the occasion and to the demands of the office to make the right decisions when they are called for. I'm reminded again of the last words from Kennedy's inaugural address, the third time in that speech in which he did reference America's civil religion. I quote, "With good conscience our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own." I wouldn't bet the farm on the Trump administration doing God's work, but based on history, I'm not yet prepared to give up all hope. Thank you very much.
Are you willing to take a few questions?
Mm-hmm.
He's willing
Absolutely.
to take a few questions. Yes.
Robert Bella's argument around civil religion sort of plays to the pieces of religiosity that are sort of universal sacredness. And one of the things that it seems to move towards is this idea of patriotism, or even patriotism. It seems to me that Trump has a whole lot of that. And how does that in any way sort of align him with this idea of civil religion?
Well, that's a good question, and certainly he tries to evoke religion more specifically. I think where it's problematic is that it is, at least by many Americans, even those I think who voted for him, seen as somewhat false to his personal character. In fact, of course, many of our other presidents were behaved in ways that were at public knowledge at the time might have discredited that. They also had a sense of the need to have a certain public persona that allowed them to do this invoking without the scorn of people toward either the hypocrisy or the contradictions in what they did in other contexts. So I don't deny that certainly Trump will, and the use of religion. This is why, in some ways, certainly there are people like Geddix and others who really question the idea of civil religion these days. They really want to get away from that, partly because the religious element has taken on a more sectarian and political partisanship term that it did not have with John Kennedy in that earlier period. And that's, I think, what they regret and why they'd like to move away from that. And in fact, Geddix himself says that he likes the term civil, but not the term religion anymore to discuss this sort of belief about American values and ideas. So I take the point, and I do think I think it will be very hard for Trump to really ever evoke civil religion in the ways in which earlier presidents did.
Presidents always are concerned about their legacy.
Yes.
The importance of the legacy. Whether they point to one thing or two things. We kind of think about presidents having certain attributes, whether it's true or false, or what they do, and then it becomes a presidential library, or whatever happens. And recently, we had inaugurated the portrait revealed of Obama's portrait. So these sorts of things that are the mythology of the president. But I have a hard time thinking of what Trump's legacy will be as a term of a positive now, because it's so often it's like, well, it should reflect something that, a turn in the way that, voting, good or bad. I'm just saying that the turn of this, or how it's showing that maybe people were not represented. These things that are kind of negatives turn to a positive, or positive turn negative. But how do you see that a legacy will be constructed, right? It will be constructed. But how do you think historians will view this legacy?
Well, so much matters on what happens, and there's a famous line from Harold Macmillan, I think at one point, being asked about plans or something, and asking if something can go wrong, and he just said something to the extent of events, my dear chap, events, that things can happen that will change. And Trump's legacy will be very much shaped by the events of his administration, as I think President Obama's legacy has been shaped by at least the central events of his administration as conceived and argued, namely the revival of an American economy, the expansion of rights and legal protections for same-sex couples, for a broader range of Americans, the end of the wars, at least the tamping down of the war on terrorism during the time. Some of those things will be central. Trump will be faced, and he's only been in there a year, so it's in effect. I think if I think about presidents after 1 year, when you look back in history, if they had to write their legacies then, it would have been very different. Richard Nixon after 1 year or 2 years or something would have been very different than after the period of time he was in office. And I do think that there will be people around who will seek to try to create a Trump legacy. It will be geared around, I think, a sort of aggressive American nationalism. America first is the theme. It may be uncomfortable to many other Americans, but on the other hand, if he serves 8 years, which would mean being reelected, which is a crucial test. Re-election is almost central to how we see whether presidents are successful or not. Were he to serve 8 years, he will have a very great capacity to shape his legacy and the ways in which future generations will see it. So I'm basically going to punt your question and say we have to just wait and see. I do find that as someone who has visited every American presidential library, it does make me wonder what the Trump library will be like. It has led to a lot of speculation about gold plating and things of that nature and all the rest, and where it would be and what it would be like. If you've been to a presidential library, and if any of you have the opportunity to go to a presidential library, I certainly encourage it as a way to get a sense of what presidents try to make of their legacies and particularly their followers then too. It will be a fascinating moment. I do hope I live long enough to see all of this develop, because it will be, I think, a really remarkable time.
Are you concerned about future candidates who might learn from Trump's mistakes and take the presidency in a more authoritarian direction?
I am concerned that every president shapes in some sense what happens after him or her. We haven't had a her, but would have been. I mean, they do shape that possibility. So were Trump to be reelected, I think he will have a much greater impact on the presidency. His defeat would put him in the category, though, more of the Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, where people talk about what to avoid. rather than what to do. So that's why the 2020 becomes so central to presidents' legacies, or the second term. And I do think that I have less, I think less probably, our recent track record has been that the candidate coming after the person is usually a reflection of a great difference from them, or at least the perceived difference. So that George W. Bush campaigned as a more honorable person compared to Bill Clinton. Barack Obama campaigned as a more thoughtful and intellectually complicated figure and driving toward peace than George W. And Donald Trump campaigned as the opposite of Barack Obama in so many ways. So I do think that'll be more the case, but I think it is crucial in some ways in terms of the longer-term impact of Trump on the presidency as an institution, whether he serves 4 or 8 years.
One more question.
Do you think that President Trump has irreparably damaged the norms of the presidency as an institution? And also this week there was a story about the German foreign minister saying, we don't understand which message to follow. Is it the tweet? Is it what he says? Mm-hmm. Is it the law? What the U.S. law is? So in that way, there's sort of, if our ally is, Germany is a major ally, if they're confused, what does that leave for the
No, it's obviously an issue. My own feeling from history is that no, it's not irreparable. We have had crises in the past. We've had difficulties with presidents. I think of the long nightmare of Watergate, as Gerald Ford once called it, our long national nightmare. When that was unraveling, I think of some other circumstances where we've gone through these things. So I don't think that the damage to norms is irreparable. I do think, in a way, Trump is sui generis in the sense that I don't think you're going to see a lot of people trying to imitate him exactly. On the other hand, again, I think again that if it's a 4 or 8 year, that will be part of the calculus as to how much it transforms the presidency and this whole notion of how authentic a political figure should appear. I think if there's anything about Trump that, of course, is I see happening, is many of the presidents I've talked about did have a veneer. They had a public posture. Lyndon Johnson, for example, who we know from the tapes could be earthy and vulgar and complicated and everything, but in formal terms was always very careful about how he spoke and addressed people. And whenever he appeared on camera was very different. That could be seen as inauthentic. I happen to think it shows a sign of respect for the institution and the rest. It will be interesting to see, and I think a lot will depend on whether it persists all the way through and whether his presidency is judged as a success for the factors of what happens in the world and on his watch. And that is, I think, very crucial.
I said that was the last question, but I noticed that the Associate Director of the Special Collections Library had her hand up, and I think we should let her ask a question. She's hosting. Go ahead, Beth.
Thank you.
President Trump has sort of aligned himself with Andrew Jackson, as you said. Does he really fully understand Andrew Jackson? I mean,
Well, I would love to know if John Meacham could find out if he read his book. That would be, but he does not. I think he digests these things in relatively small packets, and there are ways in which he is like Jackson. I mean, Jackson was considered abominable to the people who had been used to a type of presidency beforehand. I mean, his letting in all the riffraff to come into the White House during his inauguration, he was portrayed as King Andrew for his presidential powers. So there are some similarities, but I doubt that he has a full understanding of that. I think he's got the sort of snapshot, quick summary American political history notion of Jackson and very little awareness of more of the context of the times or the real complications of being Jackson and being like Jackson. So I would tend to doubt it. President Obama was fond of this, as well was President Bush and President Clinton, of inviting historians occasionally to come. I don't know whether I've lost my invitation today now by being on camera. I would love the opportunity to actually see whether there's any there, that there's any something more of substance. I mean, the historians who met with presidents oftentimes come away quite a bit impressed with how different they are from what expectations are or thoughts are before they meet them. I haven't seen it happen yet, and there's been no discussion of any sort of White House informal or other meetings. It would be interesting to see, and then to have, there probably will be, though, because if Trump starts thinking about his legacy and that issue of legacy, he's going to want someone in there who can write it in the right form and present it as favorably as possible, and so he will probably start trying to court some academic out here. I promise I will maintain my integrity, but I would be very tempted. I would be very tempted to at least find out what it was about, just out of sheer intellectual curiosity, what it would be. But it will undoubtedly happen.
Thank you, and I hope you'll all join me in thanking Professor